So, as much as I hate the idea of putting myself in front of a camera, I'm trying it. Welcome to Game Scrutiny, and today I am going to be reviewing the Games Design and Theory Masterclass by Will Wright. The course is intended for those who are looking to get into game design, and it costs £80. I will be rating it out of a percentage. I will be giving each chapter of the course a rating out of 100% and a total rating for the course as a whole at the end of the video. You can see what the percentage ratings look like here, and I will show them again at the end of the video. The introduction to this course is fairly standard. It sets up everything you're going to learn over the course, but I wouldn't say it was massively inspired. However, there are some good aspects of this course, not least the sheer amount of information included, so I wouldn't let this deter you just yet. The total watch time of the course is a little over 4 hours, so you're paying just under £20 an hour or just over $25 an hour. In the first chapter, getting started in developing a game, I wouldn't say that I personally found it massively helpful. This isn't to say that it wouldn't be helpful for everyone, but I just found that Will Wright is using lots of techniques that he uses specifically and that he's used in his own games, rather than explaining techniques that anyone could use on any game. Again, this isn't to say that there's nothing useful in this chapter. I mostly found myself picking out certain techniques that were relevant to me and disregarding the ones that weren't. The prototyping video of this chapter is the part I did find most useful. The tips and tricks are more relevant to everyone and feel like a useful as well as crucial aspect of developing a game. Wright also explains some specific techniques that he himself uses for anyone that does appeal to. However, since the bulk of this chapter wasn't too useful, I gave it an overall rating of 65%. You then move on to chapter 2, understanding your player's mind. You start off with player psychology. Wright again focuses on his own specific techniques rather than widely applicable ones. He focuses a lot on the psychology of Sims and spends 25% of this video talking about that. However, once you get past that, there is some very useful information regarding player psychology. However, one thing to keep in mind is they gloss over things somewhat. I studied psychology, and things we would spend maybe 2 months on, they're glossing over in about 10 minutes. Because of this, it may be worth taking notes from this video and going to do some further research yourself. At the end of the video, they touch on group psychology and marketing, before finishing on player communities and their ecology. You then move on to the story of the game. This video is interesting because it focuses on the relationship between the player and the developer and who has more control over the story. But there isn't a huge amount of pros or cons to this section, as it wasn't massively long. There are some crucial storytelling elements in there, so it is quite useful. You then move on to player-centered experiences. Wright makes some interesting points about balancing difficulty and boredom, as well as the techniques you can use to achieve this balance. He also talks about player failures within a game, and how to turn them from a negative experience into a positive experience. You then move on to explore the different paths players can follow in your game. Finally, this chapter finishes off with a segment on rewards and incentives and how to stop them from being too obvious when implementing them into your game. I gave this chapter an overall rating of 85% because although there are some hiccups here and there in the videos, nearly every single video in this chapter contains useful information. We then move on to chapter 3. Designing the game. This begins with a video on developing a game language. I won't go too in depth here because this chapter is almost all specific techniques and I don't just want to be taking the content from the course, stealing it and putting it in this video, but there are some very useful points in here. It more or less centers around the unspoken communication between the player and the developer as the player plays the game. They also explain how it can be used to scale freedom or complexity within a game. And they finish off by explaining how you want your game to fit into a specific storytelling archetype so that it appeals more to players. You then move on to designing a visual aesthetic, and Wright explains the importance of a visual style and how different visual styles can make a game completely different in the end result. He then explains the visual inspiration for his own games before moving on to how to collaborate with artists in studios. I didn't find this massively useful because I personally am not working in a big studio, and I'm pretty sure that most people that are watching this course or watching a review of this course are not yet working in a big studio. So it won't be helpful for anyone until at least a few years down the line. After this, you move on to a video about game mechanics. this focuses heavily on player interaction with the in-game software. Right then explains how to implement your mechanics, as well as the difference between overt and covert in-game mechanics. However, you do then go down a fairly hard to follow rabbit hole of some of the mechanics of SimCity. This is fairly frustrating as it has little relevance to most other games, so unless you're planning on building a city builder game, this probably has little relevance to you. You then get your first game demo of the masterclass. Wright takes a walkthrough of one of the games his students is creating. It's a fairly interesting video, but to be honest, there's not a lot actually being taught in it. You could probably skip this demo and you wouldn't really miss out of any of the content in the class. But it is an interesting watch. After this, you move on to designing sound in your game. This is a really well made segment, and I would argue it's one of the best made segments of the entire class. Wright does an in-depth analysis of all of the different ways you can put sound in your game and how you know if your sound design has been successful. He then does an analysis of multiple different games from different genres, not just ones that he's created, and their own sound design, as well as explaining the difference in sound design as you're approaching it, a small indie studio and a big studio. So that is very useful for the people taking the course because it means it's applicable to them immediately and also means they can learn something further down the road. I would say again that they focused a little bit too much on Sims and SimCity for a little bit too long, but it wasn't as bad as some of the other videos. You then move on to choosing and designing your game platforms. Wright explains the difference between technological, cultural, and demographic platforms. There is one point where he kind of states the obvious by saying the better your game, the wider the platforms, but it doesn't too long and was just a little thing that I picked up. Wright then talks about how he started his first company. I wouldn't say that this is massively relevant, however, the rest of the videos in this chapter were all absolutely amazing more or less, so I'm rating this chapter 90%. You then move on to chapter 4, the iterative process. This starts off with iteration and scoping, as well as touching back with prototyping. After that, they explore different scripting techniques as a way of exploring different ways of designing and approaching making your game. You then learn how to manage design risks effectively and efficiently before moving on to how to learn from failed prototypes. There is some useful information in the end summary, but some of it is also a fairly obvious recap of what you've previously learned. After this, you move on to budgeting different sections of your development team. Again, this is back to the recurring problem of most people watching this are not going to be managing a large team. They might be managing a very small team, but most likely the most they're doing is getting together with a few friends or colleagues and working on it all together. So there's not necessarily going to be one leader deciding how budgeting is managed. This is a bit of a problem for the game, but I guess it could come in useful a few years down the road to those that decide to take the course. After this, you learn a technique called the feature triage. It's a fairly specific technique useful to the course, so I won't go into all the details here, but it is very useful. You then look at a prototype case study. This is interesting and there are some useful points to be taken from it for your own prototypes. After that, you get a look at your second and final game demo. Much like the first, it's interesting, there's a good analysis, but there isn't a huge amount taught. You could skip this video and you wouldn't miss out on a lot from the course. You then move on to playtesting, and this is where this chapter really falls apart. It doesn't feel like a lot more than a repackaged version of the prototyping video. Wright himself refers to playtesting as a sort of granular prototyping, and the whole video felt like a bit of a disingenuous way to repackage a previous video and increase the runtime of the total course. However, they do go over the different types of playtesting, and there aren't different types of prototyping that are as relevant here, so there is that to be taken from this video. So this chapter was hot and cold because of the ending. There were some useful videos and there were some videos that felt like they shouldn't have been included at all, and because of that I'm rating this chapter 70%. The final chapter is titled A Career in Game Design, and it starts off with Wright explaining how to pitch ideas. He explains how to get an audience excited in your game, as well as touching upon the importance of pitching early and pitching often. He then goes over some useful techniques and styles of pitching so you can improve your own pitching skill. You then move on to leadership and collaboration. The start of this is very useful for those that want to form small groups to make an indie game. However, again, the rest of the segment suddenly flips into how to manage a large team. This is a recurring problem in this course, and it's probably not useful for those that are just getting into and learning about game design, because they're not going to be managing a large team for at least years to come. You then move on to the future of game design. Wright makes some interesting points about tablets and smartphones and how they will be impacting the future of game design and the game design economy, as well as explaining the difference between VR and other consoles and how VR is going to change the industry. He then goes on to explain intelligent AI in game systems and how they will be integrated into games in the future. Listening to Wright talk about AI is personally what I found to be one of the best bits of the whole course. You really see his genius as a game designer come forward without him focusing so much on his own achievements and his own past games. It's a really interesting insight and I personally found it really useful. Overall, I would rate this section 80% because the only downfall it had was again focusing on large teams when that's not necessarily applicable to the people watching the course. So that makes the overall rating for this course 78%. This means that for most people, this course is worth the £80 price tag. It contains good content and there are hidden gems of knowledge hidden here and there throughout the different lessons. It is also, and this bit is probably one of the best bits about this course, going to be a respected course to put on your CV or resume if you're applying to a job or thinking about going to uni. This is because it's taught by a respected industry veteran and is on a verified site of masterclass courses. However, if you're on a very low budget, I wouldn't recommend paying out for the course. The information that is included can be gathered elsewhere. It's just going to take you longer and it's going to be less concise and you're going to have to filter through the information that isn't useful. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed the review of the gaming masterclass. I apologise if I'm a bit weird on camera, it's the first time I've done it. If you did like the video, please consider subscribing or liking because I'm still growing this channel. And if you have any ideas on how I can improve my videos, be sure to leave them in the comments. I will respond and I will do my best to make the change. Thank you.